Welcome, everyone. We are going to just be giving 1 minute for some more people to arrive. But in the meantime, I'm very happy and pleased to have our guest today. My name is Catalina Ortiz. I'm the director of UCL Urban Laboratory. And as part of our celebration of our 20th anniversary, I was very keen to bring a discussion around care in the city and how can we champion and foster caring cities. And as part of this initiative, I thought of very esteemed colleagues of mine to join us to actually have this discussion. So the colleagues that we are having today have been working around this from different perspectives. And so we're going to have a very rich conversation, hopefully, in a couple of more minutes. We are recording this event. We know that for many people, this time of the day was a bit tricky. And I think something that is beautiful about the networks that we collaborate with and the possibilities that this technology is allowing us to have today, guests that are joining us from Hong Kong, Chile, and Ottawa in Canada. So we are very pleased to have, to leave this kind of global network of colleagues. So we are going to be addressing the theme of caring cities in a moment in history when there's a huge setback on gender rights, but also a very concerning rise of authoritarian regimes, of patriarchal and colonial violence. And because this is also a pressing question that is lived in the urban dimension for local governments, for social movements, but just by cities and urban scholars and practitioners like us, I thought this was kind of the right moment to actually thinking in different alternatives that can give us hope and recognize and acknowledge the practices, the transformative initiatives that we have seen emerging in the context of Latin American cities and that perhaps can teach us for other places to actually learn from the endurance, the resistance, the persistence, and the creativity of many organizations and movements that have served as the baseline for championing ideas around care and bringing care in the realm of public policy and trying to transform the contours of what an urban policy could be. So today we have a luxurious setup of guests. So with us, we have Paola Girón, who is the president of the National Council of Territorial Development in Chile. And she's professor of the Housing Institute in the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism from the University of Chile. She's also the director of the Millennium Nucleus of Mobilities and Territories and associate researcher of the COES, the Center for Conflict and Social Cohesion. In her current role and in her research life, she has given a lot of wealth of, she can help us think matters around intersectional perspective, but also mobilities of care, and how she's bringing this to the post is something that we are very curious kind of to hear. We also have with us, let me just find out my notes here, sorry. Gabriela Gomez-Montt. She is the founder of Experimentalista, and she's the current visiting professor in the Institute of the IIPP here in UCL. Now she's joining us from Hong Kong. She can tell us a little bit more what fun stuff you are doing there. She was also the chief creative officer of Mexican City and the founder of Laboratorio para la Ciudad. That was an award-winning experimental arm and creative think tank of the Mexico City government. And her work has been a lot about reflecting the right to imagination and how can we bring joy, play in as an urban kind of dimension that needs to be thought through and also governed in a way. And most importantly, relevant to what we are doing also today, she has served as an advisor of the National Policy of Care in Colombia. And we are very keen to, to hear a little bit, how has been that experience and what are kind of, these really exciting initiatives that are happening in the context of Colombia as well. And we have also Lorena Zárate, that is the co-coordinator of the Global Platform to the Right to the City and former president of the Habitat International Coalition. She has collaborated with the UN Special Rapporteur of the Right to Adequate Housing and the Office of the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights in the elaboration of thematic reports and recommendations for national and local governments. She has worked around feminization of politics and its intersection with new municipalist movement. We have worked together in many projects, and I'm very happy that you are here. So without further ado, the way in which we're going to structure this webinar is that we're going to have 3 short presentations from our guests, then we're going to roll out a couple of questions that I prepared to start the conversation, and then afterward we're going to have time for a Q&A, and you can find the Q&A box for you to start kind of popping up any ideas of questions that you want us to address. So please, Paola.
Thank you very much, Catalina. Thank you for this invitation. Good morning from Santiago. And it's a pleasure to be here today sharing with these amazing women. It's been a long time that we met, and we need to meet in person soon. So as Catalina was saying, I have moved temporarily from academia to policy. I coordinate, or I'm the president of the National Council for Territorial Development in Chile. And I'll tell you a little bit about what it is and the challenges that we have. So I'll start my presentation. Please let me know if you can see it. Perfect. So as I said, the National Council for Territorial Development was created. It puts together the National Council of Rural Development and Urban Development, because we're supposed to have a broader territorial view of what our cities and our rural areas are about. It's been a big challenge. We have 49 councillors, and we serve as a link between 12 ministries and civil society, including the private sector, civil society, and universities. And it's been quite interesting to be able to move forward ideas that we sometimes present in academia, and to be able to put them into public policy. As the mandate, we are to implement 3 national policies: the urban national policy, the rural national policy, and the territorial planning policy. Each one of them is at a different stage. The last one is quite recent, and we're developing the way to implement it. The rural one is in the process of implementation, and the urban one is in the process of updating. It's been going on for 10 years, and we're just now in the process of updating. And this is where I'm going to talk to you about a little bit more, because there's been a big challenge on how to incorporate this territorial approach that we have, and it's quite particular for our Latin American view. And also, how do we incorporate care and intersectionality into such policy? So as I mentioned, we are doing this in a participatory process, including the diagnosis, and also the way we are defining the main objectives and the main issues that are to be dealt within this policy. And what we want to include, or what the things that we want to implement, have to do with this territorial approach that we have as a council. And I don't know if you know, but I set up a PhD program on territorial space and society. And this is the synthesis of how we translate academia into ways that we can actually talk in public policy terms. So our territorial approach has to do with a relational approach, meaning that urban and rural areas are connected, and what happens in one area always affects another area. They're diverse. We live in a small country in comparison to Colombia and Mexico. We have around 18 million people in our population, but it's quite diverse. We have 11 indigenous population in Chile, and we also have very dry desert in the north and very cold in the south. So it's quite diverse in terms of people, in terms of climate, in terms of culture. It's also the approach that we have is on continuity, is on letting go of the urban limit as a way of understanding cities, and how the urban-rural interface is something that we need to look at today. It's multidimensional. It's also dynamic, meaning that it changes all the time. We have to recognize that there are conflicts. And also, we're looking at the concept of pertinence, of how we need to develop public policies that are pertinent to specific territories. And that, for us, it's a big challenge because we work in a very centralized country where most of the decisions get made in Santiago. Most of the population live in Santiago. And we're having a difficult time being able to translate our policies to be pertinent to the whole territory. So the whole decentralization process is going on in Chile right now. And in the process of updating this national urban policy, we've set up 10 principles, and we've already set up the thematic themes that are going to be part of this policy. Among the two major principles that we're dealing with is number 8 and 9 that have to do with intersectionality and care. It means that everything that we do has to consider these principles. And in the process, thinking about intersectionality hasn't been very easy. Most of the way that intersectionality gets implemented in public policy is by sector or by focusing on specific groups, being children or the elderly or people with disabilities or indigenous population. And what we're talking about in terms of intersectionality has a bit more complexity, and it's not that easy to translate. The same goes with care. And I'll explain both of them on how we can understand them in order to be able to incorporate in a national policy. So as you can see, the 8 the 8 thematic themes cross across with the principles, and have to do with housing, public space, mobility, heritage, sustainability, economic development, planning, and institutionality and governance. So when we talk about intersectionality, and we have worked a lot with what mostly Colombians and Brazilians have worked on in terms of intersectionality, it's recognizing the way that, or it's an analytical tool to recognize the way different identities get overlapped and different characteristics get overlapped, and how they are lived differently by different people, including gender, race, income, or all these different areas of life that can be that can lead to oppression and inequality or privilege. The way that we look at it is these intersectional lives or these intersectional ways of living are not permanent, they're dynamic. They change in the course of one day, and they change in the course of a lifetime. And most of the work on intersectionality, and that's something that we worked on a lot, it has a lack of spatial specificity. And we've made an effort, and I can put in the link, a book that we just published on how do we spatialize intersectionality and how do we territorialize intersectionality. And I think thinking of everyday life and the city is a really good way of looking at it, of looking at how intersectionality takes place and how it changes during the day. Like I just dropped my daughter off at school, but probably in the evening, and I have certain issues that I have to deal with in terms of walking with my daughter in the morning and what happens in the evening in different areas of town. My experience of the city changes along a day as it changes along my lifetime. So we have to really recognize how these differences and these inequalities that are present in cities are not static, but that they change. And that we need to look at, for instance, in terms of climate change, and we're having 35 degrees in summer in Chile, how these issues affect different people in different ways. Not everyone gets affected in the same manner. So intersectionality helps us to look at how everyday life changes along the day. In terms of care, we use Fisher and Tronto's definition of care as a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, contain, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. In this definition of care, which has been quite useful for us, we we really have to look at the importance of recognizing the multiple activities and simultaneous activities that are involved in care, as well as how we look at care, not just from taking care of children, the elderly, or people that are ill, but to recognize the importance of the environmental dimension of care. And that for us, in terms of planning, has become quite important because it raises issues that haven't been raised before. We have looked at as the specialization of care. I'm sorry, I haven't been able to translate this, but in the way of recognizing the different ways in which care has to be looked at in terms of cities and its specialization, look at the different subjects of care, not just take the people that need care, but also those who provide care, and all the different subjects that are part of this interweaving communities of care. Look at the different practices of care, look at the different places where care takes place, not just in terms of buildings, but also in terms of housing, in terms of the street, in terms of public spaces as well, the materiality and the objects of care, the different temporalities that take place, like rush time in the morning, or how long it takes to take care of, how care changes along the year, the affects and affectivity that are part of these dimensions of care. So when we look at all of these areas that are very important in terms of how we spatialize care, how do we translate this in terms of a public policy? What we have in Chile, we've just set up during this government, which has been considered or has declared itself as a feminist government. We established this Chile Cuida. It's a national system of care, and it's part of the 4 pillars of social security in Chile. So along with education, health, and pension, care has become one of the pillars of social security. The system is a network of services that get provided to carers and the people that take care of people. And in this area, the feminist movement both has been quite relevant in terms of putting this issue in the agenda, but also the carers have been quite verbal and present in terms of considering that the people who take care of others have to be part of the system as well. But the system is basically a way of setting up a system of different services of care. The way that it's been spatialized is through community care centers, which are buildings along the country. There's going to be at least 130 built in Chile. It's very similar to the Manzanas de Cuidados in Bogotá, or perhaps the Utopías in Iztapalapa in Mexico City. It's buildings that provide or that set up different services that are provided within each one of these buildings. And it's been quite relevant because it is the main way that this national care system is spatialized. It's quite important. It's very, very quickly that they're being built. But I think it's just the beginning of how we can spatialize care in terms of public policy in Chile. So as a council, what we've done in order to incorporate the intersectionality and care into public policy, considering that we have this national care system, is by different ways. We've set up different meetings and different discussions with specific groups. This is one example of them. When we met with different specialists and people that are active in gender care and intersectionality, in order to see what are the relevant issues that need to be considered in a public policy, in a public urban policy that incorporates these issues. The main things that have been raised is the importance and the difficulties of incorporated intersectionality into policymaking. As I mentioned before, what we have, the main way in which we incorporate intersectionality is by having different divisions. So we have a ministry or a center or an office for the elderly, another one for children, another one for people with disabilities or indigenous population, but hardly ever do we see the overlap in how migrant from another country, woman, migrant in specific conditions, has a more difficult situation than someone else that lives in a city. So that's been one of the things that we've talked about a lot. And how do we operationalize intersectionality into public policy? We just released the census data last week, and Chile is, as many other countries, we have an aging population, and our cities are not adapting. We're not adapting to climate change in a fast pace, but we're not adapting to our aging population as well. Very little attention is given to children and youth, and particularly into the intergenerational relations that we can have of how our aging population coexists with different groups, particularly children. We have a very large number of migrants coming to our country, and we need to recognize them in a specificity. Also, disability hasn't been dealt in a proper manner in terms of the city. We have a lot of advances, but there's still a lot more to do. Our view of indigenous population is very limited in terms of understanding what their definitions and the way of understanding territory can provide in terms of understanding or incorporating this into our public policy. Safety in public spaces and in the housing realm is an important issue to consider. Climate change in terms of flooding, heat, and all the implications where our country has a large coast, and any increase in the rise of sea level will impact dramatically our country, our cities in the coasts. We have major regional differences, as I mentioned before, in geographical, cultural, social terms, economic terms as well. So we need to recognize these differences. We need to understand the street as public space and what happens in our public spaces in terms of understanding gender and intersectionality and becoming a caring place, and also participation and co-creation. And I think what we found in this process is that the ways that we've included participation is not enough, and communities are particularly demanding other ways of participating in the construction of public policy, more as a sort of co-creation and not so much as a checklist of who's there and who participates. So we're really questioning the whole planning process in terms of understanding that the tools that we have for planning in Chile today are thought of for the past century and not for this century's challenges. So there's a lot of discussion on how we can improve our planning process. And from those workshops, we started looking at what would be a major contribution in terms of a public policy that incorporates care. And just recently we had a session, and we're starting a group on infrastructures of care. So the way that we're thinking about care is through our infrastructures of care. And in this way, we started talking not just with these centers of care, but also with different ministries and different institutions that have something to do with infrastructures, but sometimes don't see it particularly as care infrastructures. So we look at memory sites, and we've been working with the Ministry of Public Works, the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Social Dimensions in Chile. So we're looking at different types of infrastructures like memory sites, school, parks, library, child care centers, jails, museums, transport, bus stops, care centers, sports centers, housing. All of these, we're starting to look at them as possible infrastructures of care. Most of them are looked at as specific buildings and sites, but we need to look at the way they're interconnected and see them as networks of care, along with communities of care. Many times communities are not seen as part of these networks, and many times these infrastructures are seen as void of the communities that should be part of them. So our conceptualization of infrastructures of care is intertwining the buildings along with the communities of care. We're also looking at the different scales of infrastructures, including housing. Housing as an infrastructure, and there's a lot of work internationally of thinking of housing as infrastructure, but in the case of Chile, we're a long way from thinking about it that way, because of the way that our subsidies work. But understanding all these infrastructures, housing, neighborhood, city, and the region, how they interconnect, has been quite relevant in terms of infrastructure. We're also looking at different themes in terms of infrastructure, including safety, safety in public spaces, the way climate change and infrastructures that deal with climate change, including sewerage, for instance, and the whole way that we look at flooding as a crisis that we're experimenting, and how we need to adapt our cities in terms of care infrastructure for our survival in the future. We're looking at incremental housing and co-residence as thinking about housing and how we need to see it as an infrastructure. Food, the urgency of understanding that networks of food in terms of infrastructures of care. Water as well. We're going through droughts in Chile, severe droughts, and we need to see how water becomes a crucial element of care, as well as leisure, and how we understand leisure as also as part of care. The struggles that we see and that we're discussing has to do, we were discussing this with our Argentinian colleagues. What happens in times of crisis? What happens when and perhaps it's something that we can discuss here. We implement these policies and we set up these structures for care. But what happens when governments change or we enter times of crisis? How our communities continue to take care of each other with a lack of supervision or more than supervision, with the support from public policies. And what we see in Argentina is that resistance and groups and communities continue to care, and we saw it during the pandemic in terms of soup kitchens and how communities struggle and maintain systems of care despite public policies not being present. We're also looking at ways in which public policy repair and we've been discussing this with large infrastructures like highways that have traditionally fragmented cities, and how they're looking at repairing the damage that they've caused. And that's also part of what we see in terms of care. And also, how do we set up ideas so that policies, particularly care policies, have continuity over time. So those are the issues that we're discussing on how do we incorporate this into our urban development policy. And when we talk about caring cities, I think we need to look at networked cities in particular, because care happens in different places at the same time. Not only does care happen in the home, but also in health care centers, in schools, in supermarkets, at work, but also in the way that we move to these places. And that's something that for us is quite important. And the Ministry of Transport and the systems of transport here have discussed a lot about this. So we need to move from productive, efficient, competitive cities to caring, careful, and collaborative cities. And how do we move from that discourse and stories to a more collaborative way of thinking? Also, how do we incorporate a relational way of dwelling into our public policies? And that's not very simple, because it involves multiple sectors that are not usually able to discuss among themselves. How we link transport to housing, to public works, to energy, or to environmental issues, for instance. Also looking at humans as infrastructures, particularly in times of crisis, but on a regular basis as well. We link up all these different infrastructures that are probably fragmented, and our bodies are able to connect them. We're also looking at the differentiated ways of caring, how different ways in which we can take care and care. And also how intersectionality unveils different forms of inequality, which haven't been present in the discussion of urban development policies, at least in Chile so far. Also, how to incorporate the socio-ecological crisis, particularly in terms of climate change, into our care conversation. And also, finally, the need to transform the way we think of urban planning theory, the processes and the practices, because care and the challenges of care are leading us to really question whether we want to keep on having these transactional ways of thinking about planning towards more transformative ways of planning. So yes, that's it for me, Catalina. I hope I didn't overextend myself.
A little bit, but that was worth it. I think this is a great segue then to have perhaps Gabriela to kick us off. You are on mute, Gabriela.
The little ritual of Zoom. Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be in conversation, especially with all of my fellow panelists, and as well as everybody who is joining us. As you'll see from my presentation, it's almost as if Paola and I had a mezcal beforehand, and you will see several overlaps in terms of the thinking, which I guess should not be surprising, since I think Latin America has several similar challenges, and I also think is deeply inquiring into possibilities. So today I'm going to speak about the politics of urban care and the otherwise possible. And basically, so much of my reflections, as well as my work in different contexts and in different geographies, started off by trying to create deep entanglements between the urban, the political, the social, the creative, and the cultural, the new economic, and also start to figure out what were the tensions and the translations when one thinks of cities as multidimensional beings, and what are the new urban languages and political forms that can come out of this. So I'd say, if I had to summarize this, one of the big questions that I've been holding in all of my different lives and capacities has, where and how do we rehearse the society that we want to become? And one of the other things that I feel in this technocratic turn of urban planning that has been left out of the conversations is knowing that things such as our urban imaginaries actually are not only symbolic and they're not only metaphors, but this is actually where that thing that we call reality and our urban day-to-day actually stems from. So how do we bring back urban imaginary, symbolic infrastructures back into the conversation of urban planning? As you can imagine, since this is incredibly important, I tend to rant about this whole idea of where and how we're imagining the future of our cities. These are the first images that come up if you Google future of cities, or if you Google smart cities, which seems to be the only prevailing imaginary for cities that is traversing the world. And for some reason, for starters, it seems that the future is blue. And second of all, I don't think this looks at all like any of the cities that any of us love. So it comes to mind this phrase by Wendy Brown on doing the demos that has been very fundamental in many of much of the work that I've been doing, which is neoliberal rationality disseminates the model of the market to all domains and activities, even where money is not an issue. It configures human beings exhaustively as market actors, always, only, and everywhere as homo economicus. Neoliberalism is a rationality through which capitalism finally swallows humanity. And I think we can all say that cities specifically have also swallowed this whole. So much of the reflections that I have right now and the pleasure of working with incredibly provocative folks across the world has been, I think, to start really reflecting upon what could be the antidotes to technocratic societies. How do we move beyond optimizing only and ever for efficiency and productivity? And as Paola mentioned, I do think care is one of the big antidotes that we can start thinking of. So through my wild child, that is the Institute for Everything in Between, where I have space to deal with speculative projects and speculative questions, one of the things that I have been researching is care and architectures for collective life. So this is really trying to think 20, 30 years beyond, and what are the conversations that we're not yet having? And meanwhile, through Experimentalista, which is my organization that works with cities and NGOs and grassroots movement in several places, in several geographies, this is actually trying to put these ideas to a test. So one of the questions that I've been holding, and that started off with Bogota, actually, when I had the great fortune of being an advisor to the care blocks. This became a foundational question for us. Can a whole city be reimagined around care? And obviously, so many of the conversations from the 70s and John Tronto that Paola quoted has been around care economics. And this has a very good reason of being. Like, this is an iceberg model of capitalist patriarchal economies that I kind of love. And as you can see, what we measure in the GDP is like the two first rungs, whereas all sorts of other things, from nature to colonies to houseworking women to peasants' work to home workers, informal sector, child labor, is actually not factored into how we're measuring our GDPs, basically. And care work is invisible, it's unrecognized, and 75% of unpaid care work is actually done by women, not only in Latin America, but this is actually a number of that also is relevant to the whole planet. So one of the interesting things when Bogota got its first woman mayor, as well as first openly gay mayor in the whole of Latin America, was that because Claudia Lopez, who's the former mayor, she's been out of office for about 5 months now, when she got voted in with a lot of support from the feminist movement in Colombia. And one of her promises was actually to be able to center care throughout the city, as well as have a feminist perspective on urban issues. And she had the absolutely wonderful Diana Rodriguez Franco, that was the Secretary of Women's Affairs, in charge of this conversation, though it actually articulated the whole of government. And Diana was able to take what is usually a marginal ministry that is just many times in many places a checklist of say, do you do gender policy? And you just like, check yes. She actually was, with her team, was capable of making this into the centerfold of a lot of Bogota's policy, as well as one of the things that her government became most recognized for. So the question started in Bogota through care economics as well, because one of the things that they found very early on in the game is that there is 1.2 million women that are actually dedicated to care work on in full time, and that a huge percent of this, I think if I remember correctly, it's nearing 30%, actually is more than full time. It's weekends. They don't even have time to go to the doctor. It can be 12 hours a day because they're taking care many times of kids, but also senior citizens, their parents, maybe the parents of their significant other, people with disabilities, with chronic illnesses. And if you actually factored in the unpaid work that Colombian women do, it's actually 20% of the GDP, which is huge, as you can imagine. So they actually started with a big conversation that I do think has been a really interesting addition to the care agenda and to the urban agenda in general, is how does one spatialize care? So they figured out through GIS and spatial justice means, they figured out, okay, where are the biggest concentration of carers and the people that they care for? And where are the biggest lacks of infrastructure, and what do we do about it? So care blocks became a policy that created systems in different places in Bogota. There's nowadays 22 of them across the city that they did in only 4 years. And as you can see from this graph, basically, first of all, the question is, how do we care for those who care for us? And it truly takes into account the politics of time, because they knew that to be able to care for the carers, they also had to care for the people that they care for, because a woman doesn't want to necessarily leave their children behind, or their people with disabilities behind, while they're, for example, accessing free legal services, or while they are taking their diploma for high school, or being able to certify their caring abilities, which is all of this can be done in a care block. But so while that happens, there's also, as you can see in this picture, there's swimming pools. This is just like one care block in Bogota out of the 21. There's swimming pools where you have children with disabilities taking classes. There's community gardens. There is yoga for senior citizens. There's art classes for younger kids. There's reading circles. This is actually the women getting certified through high school. They can take computer classes, and all of this happens simultaneously. So it's really interesting to see how they've dealt with the politics of time. And this got included for the first time into their urban plan for the next 10 years. So it's already official, and it's not only about care economics, but also spatial planning now. So I find that there's something incredibly interesting there to think of care as policy and governance. And we can also go one step forward and think of care as an in-between quality and a deep organizing principle. So one of the examples that I like to put, that I'm sure Lorena will get into because she's a big housing expert and I'm sure she recognizes this image. Like 20 years back when Mexico was doing their housing policy, public housing policy, some of the social housing that they came up with this. And 20 years later, the numbers I think are 75% of these types of houses are abandoned at the moment. This is not a render. Like, these is real projects that, as you can see, have absolutely nothing to do with human-centered or caring societies. So one of the things that I love about care as an antidote is that when you add care to any sort of conversation, it shifts the conversation elsewhere. So if we think about bodies, and under a technocratic term, and housing, we can actually think, okay, we have these many bodies, we need these many roofs. The moment that you add a care, the question becomes completely different. Housing and care does not equal these images that you're seeing. So one of the most interesting jumps I feel, as you can see from Paula's presentation, that is happening within Latin America is I think that we're starting to not only think about care economics, but how do we actually also think about societies of care. So as Kata mentioned, I had the great fortune of being coordinator of advisors for Francia Marquez team. Francia Marquez is nowadays the vice president of Colombia, the first Afro-Colombian in such high power. And she actually comes from land defense, and she was a domestic worker not too long ago. So they put together an incredible group of advisors, everything from land defenders like Josefina Klinger, Arturo Escobar, fabulous Colombian academic, Julio Bango, who created the first national care system in Latin America, who's from Uruguay. And the conversation shifted in really interesting ways. The first of one was what does next generation care infrastructure look like? Very much related to what Paola presented. What does decolonial and collective care look like in a pluri-ethnic society, which is true for most of Latin America, as well as what is a territorial and more than human approach and perspective to care in a place like Colombia. So this precisely points into the direction of thinking about caring societies. This is Francia Marquez, who has been pushing for care as a fundamental human right in the Court of International Human Rights, and hopefully this will really catch fire. And very much the idea behind the caring society is, how do we think of care beyond an individual right and into a collective capacity? And what would this even entail of how we organize our societies? So Colombia, since then, this has been doing some interesting experiments, because as Paula points out, it's one thing to draft policy, and then how do we actually localize care? How do we implement projects is a whole different journey. So Colombia just passed a document called COMPES, which will actually give leeway and budget and articulate all of the ministries in Colombia to thinking about care. And simultaneously, they're also starting to do specific experiments. So I just show this one, which is a boat that is a project between Brazil and Colombia. And the populations that live across this pluvial waterway are actually, they don't really obey borders. So the care infrastructure shouldn't obey borders either. So Brazil and Colombia together this is kind of like a floating care block, if you will. They're thinking about other approaches to not only care, but also geopolitics, which I find absolutely fascinating given the turn of events at this moment in history. And I think, as Paula well mentioned, that to think about urban care and how we conceptualize care is to go beyond the conversation of cities. Cities are only 2% of the Earth's surface, but cities consume over 75% of the planet's material resources. And hence, when thinking about a national care system, which actually, from what I know for the first time, is not only includes human care, but also thinks of environmental care and more than human care, just because as in many indigenous and Afro-Colombian conceptions, everything is entangled. We also have to be thinking about the implications of urban decisions and how that actually cares or is careless with the rest of the planet. So this, I think, leads to a really interesting conversation around the DNA and ethos of our cities that stretches way beyond them. And when I was still chief creative officer of Mexico City, one of my favorite projects and experiments that we got to do was helping crowdsource the Mexico City Constitution. A constitution is a really interesting thing because besides being our highest law, this constitution has been active since 2017 and actually includes care as one of the ruling principles, as well as the right to the city. It also is a beautiful excuse for a society to think about their DNA. Who have we been as a society? Who are we now, and who would we like to become? And I think that the role of cities at a planetary scale is actually incredibly important. And again, like thinking about other type of geopolitics. One of the things that we worked on very directly, besides crowdsourcing the Mexico City Constitution, was making Mexico City into a sanctuary city, which means that when migrants are passing through Mexico City, from then 2017 until now, they cannot be kicked out of Mexico City because of, or be searched because of their migratory status. So since we became a sanctuary city, one of my, and started thinking about this, one of the biggest joys for me has been seeing how the politics have changed within the city. But of course, it's not enough because nowadays our borders are a completely different beast. But at the very least, cities can actually become these careful places that also have a place in international and national conversations, notwithstanding the national policy. One of the other things that we did during my time at the lab, and is also at Mexico City government, and is also actually part of our constitution, is in terms of spatializing care and thinking about spatial justice, which basically says that we should not follow the tyranny of the averages. Mexico City, for example, has 9% of green spaces per inhabitant, which is relatively close to what the UN asked for. But once you start figuring out how this is redistributed across the city, you'll see that places like Iztapalapa have less than 3% of green spaces, and other places like the borough of Miguel Hidalgo has more than 42% of green spaces, which makes it just as green as any of the greenest cities in the world. So how do we think about redistributing resources and spatial justice as care infrastructure? But then also, how does care and infrastructure and care also redistribute possibility? So very similar to what Paola also mentioned, it has been fascinating to see how with things such as participatory budgets in Mexico City, which we have about $50 million per year, projects such as this, food, and that include food security and that are community driven, have flourished. It has also included things such as projects driven by the local communities. This one very particularly, senior citizens that decided to make a senior citizen home that also included childcare. And so it folded in two needs of a community and also folded in a community kitchen. So how do we start thinking about not only care infrastructure that the government puts into place, but how we actually infrastructure for collective and community action? This is another project that I love, which is also done with participatory budgets, which is called Chavos Banda, where former gang members that had in the 90s, Mexico City got incredibly dangerous and a lot of people died. And some gang members came together to say, we actually need to do something about this, and we need to turn these spaces into something else. And they've created places that, for example, teach urban art, music, creative skills to former gang members and give them a way to become integrated into earning a living in different ways into society once again. And these have become actually quite interesting and successful projects. So in sum, I think that we should start thinking around relational and civic infrastructures as these communities of care. And not only the big infrastructures, but how do we also do world tending and the minor gestures to think about the micropolitics of urban care? So I just came back from Taiwan, where I spent 5 days, and I will end on this note, which is not Latin America, but that I really fell in love with. How do we actually allow and propagate for these minor gestures to also hint at these caring cities? These are public umbrellas at the subway station in Taiwan. This is a library where you can request to the main library any book that you want, and it will be delivered into your favorite metro, like subway station. And these are the ads that you see all over Taipei at the moment that basically have a world masters game for people above 60. So it's Olympics for senior citizens. And as you can see, sports beyond age, life without limits. So this is, I think, the care and the otherwise possible, which is very far away from this image that I started with. And I'd end with this provocation. We cannot force care, but can we create the conditions for care to emerge, to become possible?
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriela. Beautiful presentation. And this is a great segue actually to talk to Lorena and for her to share a little bit more of her work.
Hello, can you hear me now? Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Catalina. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to all the participants for being here today. It's a great honor and a pleasure to share this dialogue with you today around a topic that is, I think, more crucial than ever in face of all the crisis and setbacks and violence that we're living around the world, not just in our region. So I don't think we have much time, so I'm going to go quickly over this just to share a little bit about the work we have been doing as part of the Global Platform for the Right to the City that was created 10 years ago, basically as a way, I think, to overcome fragmentation. Lack of coordination, as Paola was mentioning since the beginning, also lack of imagination, I think, as Gabriela was mentioning, and in particular try to influence policies and also showing and connecting transformations initiatives already going on in different parts of the world by different actors. So one of the things that the platform does is bringing together not only civil society organizations, social movements, but also academics and networks of regional and local governments, trying to put in place and advance progressive policies. So, and as part of those groups, so dealing with housing and land rights, of course, but also dealing with food sovereignty, food security, with informal economy, so-called informal economy, and social and solidarity economy, environmental issues, and so on. Among them, a huge group of organizations dealing with gender perspective, gender approach to urban issues, and feminist urbanism, and women's rights, of course. So different networks at the global level and regional level, in particular in our region, the Red Mujer y Habitat in Latin America, and SIGSA from Cordoba in Argentina, and also in strong collaboration with some organizations in Barcelona, in Spain, as the Colectivo Puncis. So if you're interested in knowing more about feminist urbanism and the work has been done by these organizations, in some cases for many decades, we're talking about organizations here that have more than 40 decades. HIC actually also connected with the Red Mujer y Habitat is almost 50 years old. It will be 50 years old next year. So we're talking about a wealth of experience and knowledge creation and policy advocacy and capacity building at a global scale for several decades now. And over the years, we have been collaborating with more than 250 organizations in around 60 countries. So this is just a sample of the different groups participating in these initiatives. And so a few years ago, we launched different initiatives, and you can access all the information online and at the website. And of course, the first thing was, well, why, or stressing the need, why we need a gender approach and a feminist approach. And we know that a feminist approach is broader than just gender issues, as our colleagues were also mentioning. So it's important to differentiate those. And if we look at some of the numbers globally, we know that issues, very material issues, redistribution of material resources, redistribution of services and opportunities, redistribution of political power and representation, all that, and of course, cultural issues and symbolic power is all entangled. And we know that if we look at that, property in housing and land, if we look at harassment in public transportation, if we look at overrepresentation of women in the informal economy, and of course, as a colleague were mentioning, if we look at the time we spend in unpaid care work, it's of course, done in the vast majority by women. So why is this important, and why this is important to actually look from a city perspective and a territorial perspective? So also developing a manifesto that you can also read online, of course, linking with the key components of the right to the city that we develop over the years. So discrimination, participation, violence, and conflict at specific issues also touching upon our cities. And I think some of the questions on the chat are related to that. The right to housing, of course, care work, public services, economic autonomy, urban agency, diversity, and as the colleagues were also mentioned, the rural-urban linkages. This is very important because when we talk about the right to the city, we're not just thinking about, on the one hand, the materiality of the city, we're also thinking about the other political and symbolic dimensions. And we're also thinking beyond the administrative boundaries, the political administrative boundaries of the city itself. So thinking more about regions and linkages that are happening through people, through connections, things, and so on. We also work a short paper with some examples a couple of years ago in terms of the economies of different and diverse and inclusive economies. That is one of the key components of the right to the city from our point of view. And in that, we discuss the care economy, also related with the so-called informal economy or popular economy, we call it in Latin America, and the social and solidarity economy. And actually, these economies all together are the economies maintaining our cities, particularly in Latin America and in the Global South, but not only. And last year also more explicitly calling for a campaign for building caring cities, and also putting out some examples that you can see, videos and documents and reports and articles and so on from different cities around the world. Prioritizing life and care in urban planning and policies, and we also heard how that can be done. Developing care systems, infrastructures and policies, and of course, supporting community care networks. And this is crucial, and I think we need to do much more around that. So very, very quickly, in 1.5 minutes, just to share what has been happening as part of these processes in Iztapalapa, in Mexico City. It's part of the Mexico City, but it's actually some municipality within Mexico City. Iztapalapa is almost 2 million people, so it's really a city, a big city within a city, and is actually at the heart of the center of the eastern area, eastern part of the metropolitan area in Mexico. So it's connecting with the Estado de Mexico in particular, and Puebla, and towards Tlaxcala, etc. So it's a very important space, a very important area of the city and the metropolitan area, but has been stigmatized and neglected by public policies for decades. And also part of the city that has been in vast majority self-built by their inhabitants over the past 60 decades or so. So basically the former mayor of Iztapalapa decided of this program. It's called the Utopias. There's an acronym for Units of Transformation and Organization for Inclusion and Social Harmony, with actually a clear focus to implement the right to the city, and the right to the city understood as social spatial justice and environmental justice. So, and this process was also developed almost in parallel with the care blocks in Bogota, and to some extent with some kind of dialogues and exchanges and cross-learning among these different cities and public officials. So in the past 5 to 6 years, basically there are 13 utopias being built across this municipality, 1 per sub-district, and a wide range of facilities and services. So, and these are all new buildings, right? All new infrastructures. So there are more than 200 different activities and services being offered in these places, including a wide range of different sports, cultural activities, and not just courses, but also schools like film schools, music, orchestras, and so on. But also the environmental component. And this is very important. And the environmental component is not only taking care of the environment, but also recognizing and recovering and bringing forward traditional knowledge and indigenous people's traditional knowledges and practices around caring for the planet. and including food production and so on. So that's a component that we think is key, and we need to strengthen and further develop in these care places and other policies across the region. And of course, daycare centers for youth and children, elderly people, people with disabilities, and information and support and different activities for women and caregivers and LGBT communities. You can find all the information online and wonderful pictures and videos, including videos in different languages, because now the utopias are well known internationally and have been documented and with different awards and so on. But we have some questions and some challenges, and we are with other colleagues from Canada and Mexico. We are thinking and writing about this, and we have already a draft in English, so hopefully English readers will be able to access that later this year. And some of the questions, of course, is about maintenance and both in terms of personnel and infrastructures, but also the policies and services. A stronger coordination. There is a lot of coordination now among different secretaries within the city, but now the risk of centralization in terms of coordination. So how we manage and balance those tensions too. And then something that our colleagues already mentioned is this, not just participation, but public community co-creation and co-management. So how we move forward towards that. And just to finish saying that the former mayor of Iztapalapa has been elected last year, Clara Brugada, as the mayor of Mexico City as a whole. So Mexico City is a city of almost 9 million people in a metropolitan area of almost 23 million. And she has promised 100 more utopias to be built across the city, more or less 16 per year in different municipalities. So yeah, a lot of discussions going on, a lot of learning, a lot of exchanges internally in Mexico, but hopefully we can maintain these more like international dialogues and cross-fertilization processes. Thank you very much. I hope that was clear despite the velocity.
Thank you very much, Lorena. So I didn't want to cut any one of you off, despite we promised we will be doing brief presentations. But I think someone in the chat, Mifanwe, is asking, there's a lot of appetite to keep discussing this because it's opening a Pandora box. And I feel something that I feel very strongly is that this is just the beginning of multiple conversations, right? And I think just for the sake of time, what I could suggest is perhaps that we skip my questions and maybe what I can do is read out loud the questions that are in the chat. So our, attendees that are actually, some of them been researching and doing close work with that. So I see you, Adriana Majo, that have been working very closely with the care system in Bogota, is also joining us here. So I'm gonna just read the 5 questions we have, and let's try to see if we can weave and make some connections. And then we leave with the promise that we are going to be finding other spaces for keep discussing this. So the first question comes from Majo Alvarez, who was the decision to locate care within welfare as a sector at the same level of education or health. And what does it mean in practical terms? I think, yes, this is for Paola. I find this interesting and different from other places. Thanks for the great presentation. Then Ana Peso is asking, I think, to all of us, how do we reconcile security problems in Chile, Colombia, and elsewhere with an architecture of care, not a prison for residents, or a neighborhood that integrates and allows intersectionality? From Fernando Gutierrez, care has been on the global urban agenda for a few years now, with much to be done. What key lessons can we learn from how we are starting to look at care and the city in Latin America? And then Mifangwi asks us, will be the further opportunities to continue the discussion, more time to understand, learn from, and explore the implications for other places and urban studies more generally? That could be wonderful. Then Fernando Rivera says, thanks for sharing about utopias, one of my favorite policies, and also the connection with the cable bus reduces inequalities and increases accessibility. I strongly believe that care and transport are also connected, and hence the work on care mobilities. Casper Kogan, I don't know if I'm mispronouncing your last name, sorry. How to navigate this participatory, feminist, sustainable, inclusive, care-focused question in an era of political backlash and democratic backsliding, in which political attention to these subjects perhaps increasingly diminishes. I think this goes back to, you know, how I started the conversation and part of the elements that Paola was hinting around in terms of, you know, how can we think this in moments of crisis. And then Sunkana, hi, you will be our next speaker in this series of feminist urbanism. So Sunkana asked, thanks for the wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask Paola Giron to tell a bit more how intersectionality was actually operationalized in public policy. Maybe we can just share a resource for the sake of time. Okay, now, yeah, we got more questions. Arohi Dalvi, when documentation or data is unavailable for certain groups you aim to include, how do you approach engagement and ensure their perspectives are represented in planning and policy? And Maria Jose Alvarez Zapata says, I want to ask how you are exploring care infrastructure as more than physical infrastructures where care services are provided, like utopias or care blocks. What about social infrastructures? Do you believe these policies limits caregivers' mobility in the city? And then Francisco says, how do more caring cities correlate with health outcomes in the places where they've been implemented? Has this been assessed or even productive to do so? So many strands of conversation. I think we're not going to be able to cover everything, but perhaps some of you can pick up some of the elements. So perhaps we can start kind of going around with Paola and then move Gabriela and Lorena.
Okay, a lot of questions. And thank you very much, Lorena and Gabriela, for your presentations. I think there's a conversation going on in Latin America and I think it has to do with this whole notion of territory that we have in our region and body territory as a way of really understanding the implications of the inequalities that we live, not just in cities, but all over our countries. And how this notion of territory comes with a lot of social participation and social movements in the region, how we link with the decolonial thought from our region. That is something that I don't know if it's unique of Latin America, but we've been talking about this for a while. In Chile, we've had the whole feminist wave that started happening after 2017-18 was really, really important. I don't know if you know about the Las Tesis and the whole movement that created, but this government was highly supported by the feminist movement, and it declared itself as a feminist government. And the main issue one of the main issues was to install a care system. So it was one of the promises, and that's why, as a pillar of our welfare system, it was one of the promises that it installed. They're very conscious about this economic way of thinking of care and how difficult it would have been to put the whole environmental issue into this healthcare system today. But I think it's something that will happen naturally very soon. So in terms of a welfare system, the care, national care system is one of the pillars. It still has a lot more to go. It was just approved a few months ago in terms of a law. It needs a lot of budgeting. It needs a lot of implementation yet. But I think it's really one of the promises from this feminist movement that has been installed in the Chilean government. I don't know how this will last in the future, particularly because when we talk to our Argentinian colleagues, most of the advances, most of the things that they have been talking about and that we've been looking at for a while are just not there anymore. So when you ask, how do we maintain this? What we talk to them about, it has to do with the social movements and how, and because we come from Latin America. That's what we're used to. Our systems are rely on the social movements, but it's exhausting. I mean, it's really tiring. It's really tiring to have to go out on the streets every time. We've had 2 failed constitutional processes in Chile. We're just exhausted. No one wants to go out on the street anymore. No one wants to have to struggle so much. So that's why it's a huge concern for us. How do we install systems that will perpetuate in the future? And I think just building, just the architecture is not enough. I think we really need to start thinking relationally, and not just in terms of physical infrastructures, but how do these, and I think Gabriela mentioned it really well, what do they lead to? What do they form? What do these infrastructures enable? What do they generate? And who do they generate it with? Because it's not just physical. We're very, well, I mean, we have this huge national housing policy that has been copied. And when you mentioned, when you showed the Casa Seco or in Geo in Mexico City, that's part of our legacy. Our housing policy has had a lot of problems in terms of mass building housing that doesn't really recognize the whole other aspects of daily life. So I think we need to think really strongly about the linkages between communities and these infrastructures. And when you talk about safety, it's a big issue in our cities. We can't deal with safety just in a punitive manner. It's not enough. It's not adequate either, because we're not giving hope to young people. We're not dealing with what's happening in our neighborhoods. We're not dealing with what's happening in other places in our countries. Drugs and the whole drug industry provides a lot more income that we can provide our youth. So how do we deal with that? And that deals to be thinking about social policies that really, really look at the future, not this blue future, but some sort of future that's not the same as what we are living in today. I think there's a lot more relational thinking that needs to go on. And I'm really glad that you mentioned Arturo Escobar and the way that he's looking at these issues. But we really need to start thinking relationally in terms of sectors, in terms of territory, in terms of communities, in terms of investment. So how do we do this in our policy? It's not very easy. I'm going to put the link of our work on intersectionality that might be useful. But it's a lot of discussion, I think, and that's not something that we're used to. And in planning, we're not used to discussing a lot. So I think there's a lot more to do there.
Thank you, Paola. Perhaps Gabriela can pick up on this.
Absolutely. So I'm going to as well pick up a few threads, because there's so many juicy questions that we could spend like hours and hours on. But what a pleasure to hear everybody and to read the questions. So first, I think in terms of Latin America, some of the things that are surfacing for me, which could be interesting for the discussions, is one of them that in terms of care and in terms of everything, really, I think Latin America is figuring out that we need to do a very delicate tightrope walk between the critical and the possible. There's a lot of crises that we live through, but if we get stuck in reactive modes, we are going to be reacting over and over and over and over again. And there are big gaps. And I think traditionally centered is incredibly important. Children, people with disabilities, senior citizens, people with chronic illnesses, the women who are the carers, because they have been the invisibilized voices within the conversation. And simultaneously, I think that we're also starting to figure out, and this for me is one big fascinating conversation, that care should be an organizing principle. So many of the ills of the world that we're living right now, like, at the brink of this huge democratic crisis and ecological crisis, I do believe profoundly that it's been because we pretended that we could optimize for efficiency and productivity, as I mentioned. And things such as time, like, industrial time is not the same as care time. Like, care time leads to a very different space, to a very different conversation, which is, again, is also about the critical and the possible. And an organizing principle that centers care, very much to what Paola was mentioning in Chile, I also feel is one of the interesting things to come out of the national care system in Colombia, where it is, it's in charge, the ministry that is in charge is a new ministry that's called the Ministry of Equality. And this particular agenda is led by Natalia Moreno, who actually used to work for the care blocks in Bogota. And they are articulating existing policy, which includes all of the ministries, and they're also figuring out what the gaps are and then doing something about it. So as Paula also mentioned, this is not only about how we think about the welfare system, but they're looking at, for example, if you think about schools as care infrastructure, then you actually think about extended programming of schools that actually function as daycare centers. And you also think about giving kids food during that time. So there's actually healthy food that is being given that can also deal with like a big percentage of the nutritional needs of kids. And this is just like one example, but when one rethinks all of the infrastructure, all of the policy, all of the welfare, this is why I find things like care actually the best antidote to these neoliberal societies that I always rant against. Last but not least, in terms of, I'll just like circle back through this into one of the questions, have we thought about what care does for health outcomes? I think that there has to be a lot more studies on this, because on one instance, we should be thinking a lot more upstream, like, Valeria Esquivel, who's a brilliant Argentinian feminist economist that was also part of the advisory committee for Colombia. She made a really good point of saying we have to stop thinking about care as a expenditure, and rather care as an investment. So what does this actually mean in very particular things? And I'll extrapolate to the UK. Like, we've already put dollars and cents to what loneliness is costing the UK, that I can't give you the exact number right now, but Norina Hertz has a brilliant book of The Lonely Century on this, and it is insanely expensive. Suicides are at all-time high, fractured societies, and to be honest, like the democratic crisis, if you do not have a relational infrastructure, this is actually, when you vote for Trump. That's what happened. So we actually need to rescale the civic space. We need to have relational infrastructure. And then I think with care, we can actually deal with some of the very drastic health outcomes that we're seeing in terms of something like loneliness, because this is actually where it stems. And again, it's not going to ever be a technocratic solution. What many health systems do is actually become reactive instead of preventive.
Thanks a lot, Gabriela, brilliant. Lorena?
30 seconds, I guess. No, thank you very much. Fantastic questions, provocations, reflections. Looking forward to continue this conversation. Just to stress this idea that, I think precisely because the backlashes are focusing so much on gender issues and feminist agendas and intersectional agendas and social justice, intersectional social justice, including racial justice and so on. I think it's exactly because of that we need to double down on our work on care, because that means that's the core of the issue they're fighting against, right? The system, the status quo is resisting against that. So I think that, for me, that's actually reaffirming that that's exactly what we need to do. And as Gabriela was mentioning, and Paola also, in that sense, care is not just care for cities, for citizens and care for people, but it's care for the planet and care for democracy, care for society. So how we transition from caring cities to caring societies. And I think that's the key. And for that, a couple of things. One, I think we need, and that's coming from Latin America, strengthening the territorial and collective approach to this, and community-based approach to this, including, of course, indigenous people, Afro-Latin population, et cetera, that's fundamental, and that's not really totally incorporated in our policies. I think the example from the national policy in Colombia is really exciting about that. But how we move into that more. And the second one, and we saw that with social movements, I think it's not just the feminist movements that have been strengthening, but also a feminist approach and practices in other social movements. So I think we need the same with policies. No, it's not just feminist policies. It's not just care policies from the women's department and the et cetera, but mainstreaming that in all departments and in all policies. So more coordination and how the only way to transform cities and society can address violence and war and destruction and all the evil that is now going around in the world. I think the only way is centering this and changing the way we understand our territories, the way we work with each other, and the way we understand and implement policies. So thank you very much, and hope we can continue this.
Yeah, well, this is very exciting. I think something that, we have learned from feminist, decolonial, anti-patriarchal movements in Latin America is that we want to change everything. And if we want to change everything, no, vamos a cambiarlo todo is the motto, with examples and the premises that you have, kindly shared with us, is an impetus for us to thinking like an otherwise planning, an otherwise society. And I think CARE brings us a very interesting lens and political kind of tool to actually mobilize a different society. So I hope we can keep up with the conversation. We've been trying to get together, the four of us, for some time, and we just kind of see so many overlaps and so many potential strands of work. We're going to be having a series of events around feminist urbanism during this year. And I hope we can pick up and make the connections and have more time to actually hug each other, see each other, eat together, because the soup kitchens and the ethos of kind of caring for each other, having collective joy, is mediated a lot by that impetus of the soup kitchens and how we sit around the table together. And I think that is the ethos of CARE that I always hold on to, that I try to expand in the pedagogy, but also in how we create these communities, because we need to be together more than ever in this poly-crisis or civilizational crisis. So thank you very much, everyone. You will find this available online, and I hope to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much. Thank you, Abby, very much for holding us in this digital space, and we will be distributing this to the ones that sign up and couldn't make it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Gracias.